In 1990, as an adult, Anton became a follower of Jesus, the Messiah, and he saw that in an age where many Christians think the Old Testament isn't relevant, that in fact, many of the prophecies haven't even been fulfilled. So last night, Anton spoke on what scripture tells the church to believe about Israel and the Jewish people. And Anton says, if Israel is blind to Christ, much of his church is blind to Israel. Sadly, the church, who is meant to provoke the Jewish people to jealousy, has mostly done the opposite. And tonight, we welcome Anton again to shed light on why that happened. So, thank you, Anton.
Thank you, Jane. Last night we saw what the Bible has to say about God's continuing concern for the Jews, even in the church age, and about the relation between the church and the Jews. Tonight, I'll see how that worked out over the centuries. Now, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70 when they bloodily put down a Jewish uprising. The Roman soldiers were commanded by the emperor's son, Titus, and this destruction took place within a generation of Jesus' crucifixion, just as he had prophesied. That's Matthew 24:34. And as last night, all of the references, I won't speak them, but they will be in the written version, which I shall email to Jane late tonight. Both the biblical chapter and verse references and the extra-biblical references from church history. On the Arch of Titus in Rome, depicting Titus's triumphs, is an image of the Jewish branched candle holder, the menorah, and it's close by the Colosseum, which was actually built largely by Jewish slaves who had been taken captive at this time. So remember that when you see the new Gladiator film. 60 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jews in the Holy Land proclaimed as Messiah a man called Simon Bar Kokhba. Jewish believers in Jesus obviously distanced themselves from this claim and from his followers. The uprising led by Bar Kokhba was soon defeated by the Romans, and further Roman reprisals followed. Many Jews fled before Hadrian's legions and quit the Holy Land, which the Romans renamed Palestina after the Philistines. The Romans rebuilt Jerusalem and renamed it Aelia Capitolina, but they forbade the city and the area around it to Jews, except for one day every year. Now, the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, together with the absence of any centralized Jewish authority, marked the start of 18 centuries of Jewish exile. According to Jesus' phrase, as he wept over Jerusalem, it happened because, quote, they did not recognize the time they were visited. Their exile would activate the curses for disobedience specified in their national covenant. You can read them in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Jews would be oppressed and robbed, their women raped. They would be the butt of jokes, and they would find anxiety but no peace. Remarkably, though, the Jews have kept their identity in this centuries-long dispersion, just as they would have to if the unfulfilled prophecies about them might yet come true. During this exile, which they call the Galut, their separateness was upheld by their keeping of as many of the laws of Moses as they could. Gentile jealousy at their success in trade and hostility to their religion meant that they were often persecuted, and that made them stick together more closely. The church, meanwhile, kept growing in the wider Greek world. It went out beyond Israel into a region where Greek had been the common language since the conquest of Alexander the Great 4 centuries earlier. Now, Greek culture was very different from the Hebraic culture of ancient Israel, and you can see that from Paul's experience in Athens, which was recorded in Acts 17. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with Paul. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They grabbed him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, that's the town council, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we'd like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. That's the end of the quote. In other words, philosophy was just a hobby for them, not a way of life. After conquering Greece in 146 BC, the Romans adopted Greek culture and they spread it across their empire. And it's been bedrock to European civilization, Western civilization, ever since. Look at classical architecture as seen in great stately homes across Europe. Look at theatre. Shakespeare is in a direct line from Greek tragedy. Look at sport. The Olympic Games, obviously, now refounded. Plato was a political philosopher 4 centuries before Paul, who, inspired by his teacher Socrates, founded a philosophical academy in Athens. Aristotle learnt at it and wrote an entire encyclopedia of Greek thought. But the Greek mindset distorts the scriptures and opens the door to replacement theology. I'll explain that term in a moment. The Greek philosophical mindset commonly held that the deepest meaning of a text, any text, not just the Bible, was allegorical. Philo of Alexandria was a Hellenized Jew who lived in Jesus' time outside the Holy Land, obviously in Alexandria, and picked up Greek ways of thought. He pioneered the application of allegory to the Old Testament. In Genesis 28, we read that Jacob took one of the stones and put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with God's angels going up and down on it. That's the famous dream of Jacob's ladder. But Philo of Alexandria wrote that Jacob's stone pillow was really an incorporeal intelligence. That's an exact quote from the Greek. In other words, a spirit of some sort. And that he put it under his head under the pretext of going to sleep, but really to let it soothe his thoughts by being closer to his mind. That would supposedly have been the source of his dream. It's a weird view. When Greek intellectuals became Christian, the New Testament got the allegorical treatment. The main early Christian writers in the Greek tradition became known as the Church Fathers. Clement of Alexandria, who died in 215, wrote that when Christ said, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head," he meant that only upon the believer, who is separated from the world and its wild beasts, does the word of Christ lay its head. When 5,000 people were miraculously fed on 5 loaves and 2 fish in John 6, supposedly the 2 fish meant the curriculum of study of Greek philosophy. The development of allegory in Christian Bible study is traced in an excellent book by Edwin Hatch from the Victorian era, called The Influence of Greek Ideas and Usages Upon the Christian Church, and I commend it to you all. A century or two later, the extremely famous theologian Augustine of Hippo, who died in 430, wrote about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here is the parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, where he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Also a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, took pity on him. He went to the man and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said. "When I return, I'll pay you for any extra expense you may have." Now, which of these three do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? That's from chapter 10 of Luke's Gospel. Here is Augustine's take on it. A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace, from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality, because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. The thieves are the devil and his angels, who stripped him, namely of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead, because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives, but insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he's dead, so he's called half dead. The priest and the Levite, who saw the man and passed by, signify the priesthood and the ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Samaritan means guardian, and therefore the Lord himself is signified by this name. The binding of the wounds is the restraint of sin. Oil is the comfort of good hope. Wine, the exhortation to work with fervent spirit. The beast is the flesh in which he deigned to come to us. The being set upon the beast is belief in the incarnation of Christ. The inn is the church, where travellers are refreshed on their return from pilgrimage to their heavenly country. The morrow is after the resurrection of the Lord. The 2 pence are either the 2 precepts of love or the promise of this life and of the life to come. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The supererogatory payment is either his counsel of celibacy or the fact that Paul worked with his own hands in case he should be a burden on any of the weaker brethren when the gospel was new, although it was lawful for him to live by the gospel. Now, this allegorical view is obviously not Jesus' short, sharp, pithy point when he told the parable to a self-righteous lawyer who was asking who his neighbour was. The effect of Augustine's analysis is to make people think they can't grasp Scripture for themselves, and to suppose its meaning is reserved for professional theologians, academics, and philosophers to work out and to hand down. And that even though the New Testament is deliberately written in Koine Greek, street Greek, simple Greek. Augustine and the other allegorizers before him are taking their wider understanding of Scripture, which they got from its plain meaning, and they're using it to reimagine the parable. The result makes no valid point which can't be got directly from the plain meaning of the Scriptures. Prophecy was also allegorized. Justin Martyr, who was martyred around 165 AD, said of the prophecy of Christ in Isaiah 9 that the government shall be upon his shoulder. Justin said that it meant Christ would be stretched out on the cross. At this point, these allegorizing parlour games actually get in the way of faith. Justin Martyr was first to call the church the true spiritual Israel. But Romans 11, the key passage of Scripture on this subject, portrays the church as a branch grafted into the tree that is Israel. The earliest description I've found of the church as the new Israel is by a man called Theodoret of Cyrus, who died in 458. The church as the spiritual Israel, or the new Israel, is the origin of replacement theology, which I mentioned yesterday, the view that the church has replaced Israel totally in God's purposes, and that for rejecting his son, God has thrown the Jews on the scrap heap of history. But this is far from what the New Testament teaches in Romans 11. Replacement theology then developed and unfortunately went mainstream. The non-canonical letter of Barnabas, so it's not in the Bible, was written based on internal evidence between the Romans' destruction of the temple in the year 70 and the further Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 132-5. This letter insists Christians should not say the covenant is both theirs and ours. This confusion over covenants would get worse with time and with anti-Semitism. The Barnabas letter also suggests that because the descendants of Jacob would dominate the descendants of Esau, we're told that in Genesis, The church is to be identified with Jacob and the Jews with Esau, even though the Jews are descendants of Jacob. Origen, who died in 254, spiritualized the scriptures so that they were not now to be taken literally but allegorically, including the idea of Israel. Old Testament prophecies could then be appropriated to the church as supposedly being the new Israel. Origen thereby reinforced the replacement interpretation of the story of Esau and Jacob, as did Tertullian, Cyprian, and Irenaeus in a tradition that would run several centuries to Augustine of Hippo, who I've just mentioned, and who did the same. Eusebius was Bishop of Caesarea and was a contemporary of the Roman Emperor Constantine, the man who promoted Christianity and began its institutionalization after he, Constantine, won power in 312 AD at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, north of Rome. Do go and see it. Eusebius reported a letter which Constantine sent to the churches after he had chaired the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, and included the following words. This is Constantine. Let us then have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd, for we have received from our Saviour a different way. Let us with one consent adopt this course, and withdraw ourselves from all participation in their baseness. Hatred is also manifest in the words of Bishop Hilary of Poitiers, who died around the year 367, that the Jews are, quote, a people who have always persisted in iniquity, and out of their abundance of evil have glorified in wickedness. If God said as much through some of the Old Testament prophets, he always did it out of love, not out of hate. Worst of all was John Chrysostom, who died in 407. Chrysostom means golden-mouthed, and he was a great preacher and writer of liturgy. There's no doubt of that. But as far as the Jews go, he was anything but golden-mouthed. He delivered 8 sermons against the Jews in his see of Antioch, where there were many Jews and where some of his flock were hanging out in synagogues and Jewish homes. These sermons make false accusations and express intense hatred of Jews. And I mean Jews, not just Judaizing Christians who mistakenly wish to put the church under Jewish law, as Paul argued against to the Galatians. Chrysostom's words often target the synagogue itself. He said that Jews, and I now quote, live for their bellies, they gape for the things of this world. Their condition is not better than that of pigs or goats because of their wanton ways and excessive gluttony. They know just one thing, to fill their bellies and be drunk. He also said in this series of sermons that the Jews themselves are demons. Now, I said that Constantine became emperor in 312 and soon put an end to persecution of Christianity throughout the empire. The Jews regarded Christianity as a heresy of Judaism, and it is true that they'd often got Christians, particularly ethnic Jews who had converted, into trouble with the authorities. But now, with no Christian forgiveness, the boot shifted to the other foot. Constantine founded the city of Constantinople on the site of a village called Byzantium, today Istanbul, to which he relocated from Rome. The Greek-speaking eastern part of the empire was now run from Constantinople. The Latin-speaking western part continued to be run from Rome. A last pagan Roman emperor, called Julian the Apostate, encouraged the Jews to rebuild the temple in the year 363. The work even began, but a large earthquake stopped the project, killing or injuring many workers. Resumption of work was then halted when fire burst spontaneously from the foundations. This event is recorded by a pagan historian called Ammianus Marcellinus, writing less than 30 years later, and by a Christian historian called Sozomen, writing 80 years after the event, who said that he had interviewed eyewitnesses. It raises a fascinating question. What would happen if the Jews try to rebuild it today? After Julian the Apostate, the ban on Jews entering Jerusalem was enforced again. From 381 AD Constantine's successors made Christianity the only religion recognized by the authorities in the Roman Empire. By this time, the Jews were writing down their traditions and commentaries on the Old Testament to preserve them in their exile. The result is a large work called the Talmud. Various rabbinic schools had contended around Christ's time. The Talmud conveys mainly the views of Hillel's school, which prevailed. The western half of the Roman Empire now crumbled into a dark age, in which people lived by subsistence farming, the urban population fell sharply, goods not produced locally became scarce, and literacy plummeted. The eastern half of the empire, that's now the Byzantine Empire, carried on and contended with the pagan Persians for power in the region east of the Mediterranean. The politicized Christianity of the Byzantines, following John Chrysostom, was markedly anti-Semitic. The Persians captured Jerusalem in the year 614 with the help of a significant number of Jewish soldiers. They held it until 629, so for 15 years, when the Byzantines won it back. A new power then exploded out of Arabia, Islam. In 637 AD, the first generation of Muslims captured the Holy Land. These changes of ruler all match Jesus' prophecy that Jerusalem will be downtrodden by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Byzantium kept Islam out of Eastern Europe, but the Persian Empire was overrun by Muslim armies, and its Zoroastrian religion was replaced by Islam. Muslim rulers built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Temple Mount, but they did permit Jews to move to Jerusalem and live there. In the year 1071, Byzantium lost a major battle against Muslim armies in the east of Asia Minor and had to ask Western Europe, which was just emerging from its dark age, for help. By then, the Latin and Greek-speaking churches, that's the papacy and the Orthodox Christianity of Byzantium, had fallen out, and the papacy turned the Byzantine request for military help into a campaign to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. These were the Crusades. Now, as a response to centuries of Islamic military campaigning against Europe, and as an episode in the ebb and flow of empires, the Crusades are unexceptional. Although from the theological standpoint, Jesus had said that his kingdom was not of this world, at least at the time he spoke. In 1099, Crusaders took Jerusalem from Islamic control and massacred all Muslims and Jews in the city. A lifetime later, Muslim forces regained Jerusalem and soon took back the rest of the Holy Land. Further crusades proved futile, and Palestine would remain in Islamic hands until the 20th century. In the 11th century, one group of migratory Jews had reached the Rhineland. At that time, they comprised perhaps 3% of worldwide Jewry. They then spread eastward into Central and Eastern Europe. These are the Ashkenazi Jews who, including offshoots in the USA, and I'll tell you later how they got there, the Ashkenazi Jews had grown to 92% of Jewry between the two world wars. Incidentally, some people claim that they are ethnic Khazars, a tribe, a Turkish tribe from the mid to far east. The best argument against that, because I don't believe it's true, is that in the language of the Jews of Europe, there are absolutely no loanwords from Turkish languages, whereas Yiddish, their language in Europe, it's packed with words from the Germanic lands in which they lived. As Western Europe emerged from its dark age, these Jews fulfilled a valuable function. The Catholic Church banned usurious lending, but Jews were permitted to lend at interest to Gentiles in the law of Moses. So they became moneylenders. This did nothing to increase their popularity, which was already low because they were labelled Christ killers. They also became merchants because they were excluded from the medieval guilds, the trade unions of the medieval era. They became merchants because they had a ready-made international network amongst themselves and because they were better educated than most Gentiles. But as economic growth in Europe continued, more money was required than the Jews were able to lend. And the Catholic Church, deciding to change its doctrines at this time, borrowers turned instead to Gentile merchants. By the 14th century, the Jews had become superfluous and they lost the protection that their value as traders and as lenders had given them. At various times, Jews are restricted to live in specific parts of cities, that's ghettos. They were forced to wear distinctive clothing, that's in the 1555 papal bull Cum Nimis Absurdum. They were subject to property confiscation, they were forbidden to gather for Jewish worship, and they were ordered to convert to Christianity or leave the country they were in on pain of death. Jews who converted were often monitored minutely for adherence to Jewish practices and might be accused of heresy and put before the Inquisition merely on suspicion. Inquisitorial trials were far from impartial, and heresy was seen in medieval Catholic Europe as treason, punishable by death. Ultimatums expelling all Jews are issued in England in 1290 by King Edward I, Spain in 1492 by Fernando and Isabella, Portugal by Manuel I in 1496-7, and in France 4 times between 1254 and 1394. The Jews were readmitted on each occasion in between, and that facilitated repeated ransom. Whenever a deadline for expulsion loomed, Jews were forced to sell their properties far below normal market value. The Jews who quit Spain in 1492, the year it also expelled the last Muslim rulers of its south, and the year it sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, 1492, a momentous year. The Jews who quit Spain that year and quit Portugal 5 years later were known as Sephardic Jews, in contrast to the Ashkenazi Jews. The Sephardim settled in various places, including the Ottoman Empire, which actually welcomed them at this time as an asset. And the Ottomans by then had taken over the Balkans and overrun Byzantium in 1453. What about the Reformation? In the 16th century, Martin Luther, greatly aided by Gutenberg's invention of printing, criticised unbiblical practice and corruption in the Catholic Church and sought to get the Church back to the Bible. He began this movement in 1517 in Germanic lands, but he and his followers were soon excommunicated by Rome, and they founded the first Protestant churches. Some Germanic rulers converted and protected the movement. At first, Luther was sympathetic to the Jews. In a 1523 essay called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, he wrote, "I would advise and beg everybody to deal kindly with them." Gradually, though, he turned against them. It's presumed he thought they'd come to Christ when they heard the Protestant presentation of the gospel rather than Rome's, and when they still did not convert, he grew disillusioned with them. In his book of 1543, On the Jews and Their Lies, he wrote, "After the devil, you have no more venomous, violent enemy than a real Jew." In this book, he called for their synagogues, schools, and homes to be burnt so that they should live in barns, that they should have no legal protections while on the highway, that their wealth be confiscated and handed back only to those who convert, that their living should derive from hard manual labour, their prayer books and Talmudic writings be taken from them, and that rabbis be forbidden to teach. Luther summed up this passage with the sinister words, "If this advice of mine does not suit you, find better, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable devilish burden, the Jews." Well, 400 years later, the German people found the advice of Adolf Hitler. In Luther's penultimate sermon, preached days before he died in 1546, Luther accused Jewish doctors of poisoning people and again called for the Jews to be driven out of Germany unless they converted. With this start, the Reformation did not at first improve the situation for Jews in Protestant lands. Nonetheless, the monolithic Catholic form of Western Christianity, with its anti-Semitic characteristics, was splintered, and soon Jews could avoid religious persecution by moving from one European country to another. Of the major Protestant movements that grew in Northern Europe, one was markedly pro-Jewish, and that was the English Puritans, and that, in turn, is the deep background to the Balfour Declaration. For the Puritan view flowed after 1688, when English nonconformism was made legal at the Glorious Revolution. The Puritan view flowed into English nonconformism, and in the 19th century into British wider society. Now, the religious freedom that grew out of the splintering of the church in Western Europe was abused in a secularizing movement in the 18th century, the Enlightenment, of course. Religious persecution of Jews dwindled in lands where secularization was significant. They were permitted to become citizens, and since then they've been influential in Western civilization out of all proportion to their number. This is documented in a remarkable book by a Gentile from California called Stephen Pease, called The Golden Age of Jewish Achievement. It's 15 years old. Here's my copy, and I commend it to you all. The Golden Age of Jewish Achievement by Stephen Pease. Between 1901 and 2007, for example, Jews won 48 of the 181 Nobel Prizes that were awarded in my subject, physics. That's more than a quarter, even though the Jews comprised only 0.2% of the world's population, and perhaps 1% of the population of the developed world, countries that stood a chance of hosting a Nobel Prize winner. This influence of the Jews triggered jealousy and resentment against them, culminating, as we know, in the Holocaust in Germany. Now, we've just about reached the era of the Zionist movement. Theodor Herzl, who lived from 1860 to 1904, was a secular Jew, who in 1896 published a book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, advocating a return to the Holy Land. His argument was that although Jews were tolerated in many places, they were welcomed almost nowhere, and toleration might cease, as it did. Herzl organized World Zionist Congresses that were held every 1 or 2 years from 1897. By then, Jews were moving systematically in small numbers to Palestine, which at that time was part of Syria within the Ottoman Turkish Empire. The Zionist movement was, unsurprisingly, strongest where Jewish communities were oppressed. That's part of Eastern Europe and Russia, where the Orthodox Church prevailed. There were significant pogroms in the parts of Imperial Russia that correspond to Ukraine and Belarus today during the years 1881 to 84, and especially 1903 to 1906. Those pogroms triggered the migration to America of some 2 million Jews. At the time, that was about 1/4 of world Jewry. And by the way, during that second pogrom, 1903 to 06, our Prime Minister was Arthur Balfour, and he limited Jewish immigration because he thought that too many Jews were coming here. Of course, a lot of them ended up in the East End of London at that time. After World War I, Palestine was run by the British, originally with the aim of welcoming Jewish migrants, in line with the Balfour Declaration, which the same Arthur Balfour had made in 1917 when he was Foreign Secretary during World War I. Now, the intent of the Balfour Declaration to welcome Jewish migrants back in the Holy Land was subverted. But nevertheless, the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948 in the wake of World War II. That's an epic tale, but it's not my tale tonight. The proportion of the world's Jews who live there has gradually increased and today is nearly half, with about as many again in the USA. Less than 1/10 of the number of Jews resident in the USA live in any other country. Soberingly, you might think that this is a good thing, but it worries me. In the USA, they are assimilating. When that began to happen in Germany, God refused to let it go on because he had called them to be different, and the results were catastrophic. I wish the USA well, but I tremble for the Jews there in the coming decades, and even for the USA itself. What is going on in the Middle East today? God said that someday he would make Jerusalem a cup that sends all surrounding peoples reeling. That's from the prophet Zechariah. The prophet Joel warns that a world army will one day be sent against Jerusalem as history reaches a climax. Israel's Muslim neighbours hate the Jewish state, as we see abundantly today. But the West, whose culture has distributed itself worldwide, engages with Islam for oil and because the Islamic minority is growing within itself due to immigration. Meanwhile, Jerusalem consistently proves to be the stumbling block in negotiations between Israel and the Arabs. As a result, world politics is moving to focus on an area of land no bigger than Wales, that's the Holy Land, and within it in one city, Jerusalem, exactly as the prophets foretold. Most Christians still don't understand the significance of the return of the Jews, but the Israeli government recognizes increasingly that the best friends it has among Gentiles are those Christians who get it. And the number of Jews in the Holy Land who believe in Jesus Christ is in the early stages of an exponential growth. As I said yesterday, these are exciting times to be a believer in the living Lord Jesus Christ. And on Thursday, I'll look at the Greek and the Hebraic mindsets in the church and in our culture. Thank you, Jane.
That was very interesting. I actually learned some things I didn't know about the early church fathers. I knew that they were anti-Semitic and much of what they said, but one or two of those things leave you kind of quite open-mouthed, don't they?
I have to say, I regard some of those allegories as bonkers.
Absolutely. And oh dear, the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's just takes the biscuit, I think. And, because we have Aaron Imey as our new boss, and he's going into the Jewish roots, how Jewish people look at the scriptures. And the first thing is just take it literally as it is. So for them to have
Yeah,
ever been,
I will be going into that tomorrow when I look at the difference between the
yes,
Hebraic and the Greek worldview.
yeah, right, good. So has anyone got a question? So please unmute yourselves. And if you've got a question, put your hand up or shout out, perhaps. Linda, you look.
Hi,
Oh, you.
hello, hi there. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Anton, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I come up with a few uh, little bits. One thing was about the Ashkenazi Jews. They became 92% of Jewry. And did they start from only 3% leaving the Holy Land? Did I understand that correctly?
When they reached the Rhineland, and no one quite knows how they got there in the 11th century, they were perhaps about 3% of worldwide Jewry. And they'd grown to 92% between the two world wars. Indeed. Most of the
Yes.
rest were the descendants of the Sephardi Jews who were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in the late 16th century.
So that's very interesting. So then
15th century.
in one generation, they become almost the full population of
No, not one generation, from the 11th century to between the two world wars.
I see, sorry, from the 11th century to the two world wars. Okay,
Yeah.
That's what I missed. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
They were very vigorous in reproducing in Egypt, but they weren't that vigorous.
Yeah, right, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Like the pilgrims. Yeah,
Indeed.
over here, yeah.
Any more questions? Comments? Julia?
Yeah, I was interested in the whole presentation. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Really good. I'm curious about two things. One is about, do we have any idea of how many Sephardic Jews are in the world today, or if that balances out with the Ashkenazi, or any ideas?
To some extent, it's self-identification because back in the Holy Land, they're intermarrying with each other.
Okay, that's a good answer. The other thing I was puzzled about as well, in Jerusalem, I met a gentleman who was helping a gentleman called Dr. Donald Yates. Now, Dr. Donald Yates had taken DNA samples from the Egyptian mummies, including Tutankhamun's mother, as I understand, and that there was unique Jewish DNA markers, which are unique to the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardi Jews, and the Jewish people beginning with the K that you mentioned. Now, as a result of that, he appeared on the Jonathan Bernis show, and people started to apply to get their DNA to find out about their sort of Jewish history. I just wondered whether you had any insights on that, or
Do you know when the DNA testing was done?
No.
What is this very recent, or is it more than a decade ago?
Give me a moment, I'll go and pull out the paperwork.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'll explain that the reason I ask that is that only in about the last 15 years has it become possible to do whole DNA, whole genome sequencing of people's DNA. And the results of the whole genome sequencing confirm some of the results looking only at specific sites on the human genome where there is variation, and have overturned some other results that were provisional. We've got a lot more information now, and information that we have on a genetic basis about early migrations. Some of it has been overturned, some of it has been confirmed. I trust very much the results of recent DNA testing, but nothing from over about 10 years old. There's a wonderful book on this, looking at the world's peoples continent by continent, called Who We Are and How We Got There by David Reich, a Jew, coincidentally. So do tell me when this was done.
This was done 2014.
Oh, right on the cusp. Do you know if it was looking at the whole genome and at every point on the human genome where there's variation between different people, or if it was looking at the traditional 7 or 8 sites of variation on the genome that earlier studies looked at?
The truth is, I don't know.
Okay. Well,
So,
I have to say a lot will depend on that. If it's a whole genome test, then I would regard that result as established. If it's looking only at a few of the sites of variation on the human genome, more work needs to be done.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
What's the book again, please?
The book I just mentioned,
Yes.
it's called Who We Are and How We Got Here.
When you send your notes, Anton, will you be adding those books on the end? Or?
No, it's very, very much off topic.
I mean, would you perhaps, what I mean is, would you note it in the email?
Yeah, sure. Can do.
Yeah. Good.
And it's by the author again?
David Reich, as in the Third Reich, unfortunately.
Oh dear.
Okay. Thank you.
The anti-Semitism throughout the centuries has been based on the Christ killers, treating the Jewish people as having killed Christ. And yet yesterday you were saying some very interesting things. You were saying that, you think it was the Jewish people and the Gentiles and the Italians, the Romans, and that was part of God's intention, that we all put him on the cross.
That's certainly a view of mine, yes.
Yeah. But we went on to say that actually
he was absolutely stitched up politically by a combination of Jews and Gentiles.
So that's interesting, isn't it? That you can't point the finger. And anyway, he voluntarily laid his life down, as we said from John 10.
Yes,
Nobody
indeed.
takes my life from me. I lay it down. So
do you not think I could call up a legion of angels to get me out of here? Yes.
And yet all that anti-Semitism based on it. And one of my previous heroes was sort of Augustine, sadly, and Ambrose. I was very impressed with the story, and this is leading to a question, that Ambrose was a great preacher in Milan.
Ambrose of Milan, yeah.
Yeah.
The man who converted Augustine.
Yeah. So Augustine goes along, and Augustine was something of a philosopher. He looked down on the Christians. He said they can't put two words together. They can't make an argument to defend their case. They're, nullheads. And he goes and hears Ambrose, who builds up this fabulous philosophical argument against Christianity. And Augustine's going, yeah, that's right, And then along comes Ambrose and shoots it down, his own argument, and brings him to Jesus. And he's gloriously converted to being a Christian. This is Augustine. And I thought, oh, so good. What a great story. And then I found out that then they were so anti-Semitic. And there's Ambrose saying, burn the synagogues down, sort of like kill.
No, Ambrose didn't actually do that.
Ambrose said it. He was really against them. He didn't do it.
No, that's not true. He was saying, if I said that they burnt them down, it's a misunderstanding.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
But Augustine, my main concern about Augustine is that on the basis of one word in one parable in Luke's gospel, he believes it was okay for the church to use coercion and force in converting people. And that was where the ruler, who held a grand dinner that a lot of people decided not to come to, and he said, go out into the highways and byways and compel them to come in. And on the basis of that one word, compel, against the whole of Jesus' words of, if they don't listen to you, shake off the dust and go on to the next town, Augustine justified the use of force by the church.
Oh, but my question will go on to say, all the good that someone does as a Christian, what happens when they suddenly turn around and persecute a group of people, when they hate God's very own ancient people? Does it negate all the work they've done before? It's kind of ruins it all in a way, does it not?
Well, the question is, what is the state of their faith on their deathbed? And only God knows that, and it's only God who can judge.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we will come to say, but it is interesting, isn't it? It's like a lot of the greats who sin and fall. Does it take away all the books they've written beforehand, or so?
And then there's the old Calvinist dictum about, is once saved, always saved true?
Yeah.
Now, I personally don't believe it is, but I'm not encouraging anybody tonight to start a debate on that subject.
No, perhaps we should see if there's another question. Any more? Anything else?
I just wanted to I picked up something you said, Anton, about that you had concerns about Jewry in the United States, in America.
Yes.
And I wondered really why you felt that way. I mean, I think for being an American, seeing what's happening over here, if you're a Christian or you're a Jew, you've got the cards stacked against you. People seem to dislike us. I don't know why.
I don't dislike the USA, and indeed I shall be grateful to my dying day for having been brought up in freedom in an island off Western Europe as a result of the American nuclear umbrella, because communist Russia was aggressively expansionist and Western Europe was not defensible by conventional means from the Red Army. What I was saying was that roughly half of the world's Jews are in the USA and they are assimilating. God does not permit Jews to assimilate unless they come to Jesus Christ. He simply won't have it. He feels so strongly about that he had the Holocaust enacted when it was going on in Germany and Central Europe. And as they are assimilating in the USA, I tremble for what is going to happen to them there. I can see very dark times ahead for them. And that means that the USA must somehow turn into a country that persecutes them. And unless either all the Jews in the USA or a large number of them rapidly come to Jesus Christ or flee to the Holy Land, then my great fear is that they will face a great persecution in your great land, Linda.
Do you think, thank you, I mean, just do you think it's, do you connect that to the Palestinians that have been protesting here and in other countries in Western Europe against the Jews?
Well, the protests that have been going on for a bit over a year now, since the October the 7th massacre of Jews, are due largely to the fact that Western European governments have facilitated Islamic immigration over the last 30
Right.
years into Europe. And if you look at what the Quran has to say about the Jews, you'll find that those Muslims are not friends of the Jews. And that's why these demonstrations are taking place. I've little knowledge of how much Islam there is inside North America.
I don't know, it varies from place to place. Certainly in the state of Minnesota, I don't know the numbers, but it's staggering. There are a lot
these
of
immigrants
representatives there.
Are these immigrants or converts?
Some of them were born here because they've been here for many generations. Some people are immigrants, and one person, Ilhan Omar, you might have seen her on the news. She comes from Somalia, I think in the 80s or something. And she's, yes, she is, sorry, yes, she's an American politician. She's from Minnesota, and she's really very radical. And so many people are sort of trying to follow her, but there's not much national support for her. So the pendulum is swinging the other way in support more of Christians and Jewish faith. Certainly over the last few years, and there was, I think, this last couple of weeks ago, we had a referendum on that as well at our in our election. You know,
there's the verse that says, God's first of all, he'll send a fisherman to bring people back, and then he'll send the hunters. And that's what I think, is that what you're thinking, Anton?
Pretty much, yes, I guess so. It worried me that in the 1930s, not many Jews in Europe were prepared to migrate to the Holy Land. They hoped that it would blow over. It didn't.
I couldn't believe it. World War I.
Great movements in history can blow up in one lifetime. Look at Napoleon and the French Revolution. The whole thing happened between 1789 and 1815. That's just 26 years. Look at Nazism. Admittedly, it blew out of World War I, but even if you include that, everything happened from 1914 to 1945.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, that might be a good time to wrap up. We're going to have the notes. If you would like a copy of Anton's talk tonight, will you email me? I'll just put my email address again on here, and then I'll send it back to you. I sent it to some people last night.
Yeah, I would love a copy.
Yeah.
I'm looking for your email address.
So you write to me and I will send it to you. janem@cmj.org.uk. And tomorrow night, we're going to hear Greek versus Hebrew thought.
Not tomorrow night, Thursday
sorry.
night.
I keep saying tomorrow. I always think of it in 3 nights. Sorry. We have a break tomorrow, and then you can gather your friends and come back on Thursday evening to hear the Greek versus Hebrew thought in the church and in our culture. And it is very different, but it'll be very interesting to hear what Anton has to say on that. So do come along, and I look forward to seeing you all again Thursday. If you want the papers, write to me and I will send you Anton's talk as soon as he sends it to me. So thank you very much, Anton, for another inspiring and interesting thought.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Learned a lot.
Yeah, really lovely.
Bye. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.